Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Mary Elizabeth Meyer was born in Germany in 1842, a time marked by significant political and economical turmoil. There was widespread poverty and food insecurity, which was worsened by a series of poor harvests and a devastating potato plight between 1845 and 1847. Industrialization was beginning to take hold, but it created stark divides between the emerging working class and the entrenched aristocracy, leaving many rural and urban laborers struggling to survive. Politically, the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 states, was dominated by conservative monarchies that resisted calls for liberal reforms, national unification, and greater democratic participation. Intellectual movements advocating for constitutional governance and civil liberties were gaining momentum, but their ideas were suppressed by strict censorship, political repression, and state control. These combined pressures culminated in the revolutions of 1848, when protests and uprisings erupted across Europe, demanding economic relief, political reform, and national unity. When these revolutions failed, many Germans, particularly those who wanted to leave the ongoing economic hardships, emigrated to the United States, where they sought better opportunities to rebuild their lives and secure a more stable future for their families. The promise of abundant farmland, industrial jobs, and the opportunity to escape the turmoil of their homeland drew many German families to America during this turbulent time. Mary's parents decided to cross the Atlantic and make a new start in the United States. They settled in the Midwest, a region that embraced German immigrants for their agricultural expertise and strong work ethic. However, life for immigrants was far from easy. They faced language barriers, cultural adjustments, and the daunting task of building a life in an unfamiliar land. Despite these challenges, Mary grew up in an environment shaped by the values of perseverance, hard work, and resilience. Little is known about Mary's life when her family first arrived in America, but it can be assumed that, like most German immigrant children in the Midwest during the 1850s, she would have received some education. German immigrant communities often established their own schools, especially in areas with large German populations. These schools typically taught both the German and English language, and often included religious instruction, which reflected the strong connection between education and church life in their communities. Although access to schooling could be limited in rural areas, where children often balanced school attendance with farm work, German immigrants were known for their strong advocacy of quality education. Mary married a young man who, like her, had emigrated from Germany to Ohio. He served in the Union Army during the Civil War, but tragically, he disappeared while on military service and was presumed dead. His sudden loss left her a widow at a young age, a devastating blow that affected her deeply. During the 19th century, it was often difficult for widows to remarry, as social expectations and limited opportunities made it challenging for women to find new partners, especially in the wake of such a loss. Eventually, she remarried. Her second husband was named Charles Bach, and he was also a German immigrant who, like Mary's family, had come to the United States in search of better opportunities. Charles, born in 1823, was 19 years older than Mary, and together they settled in Wood County, Ohio, a region known for its fertile farmland and growing German-American community. They had 3 children together: Charles Jr., born in 1868, Mary, born in 1871, and Catherine, born in 1875. The family initially thrived in their new life in Wood County. The farm provided a steady income, and they became an integral part of the local community. However, their prosperity was short-lived. The Panic of 1873, a nationwide financial crisis, led to widespread business failures, bank closures, and high unemployment. This economic downturn affected many people, all of who found it increasingly difficult to maintain their farms and financial stability. The emerging weight of the crisis made it clear that the relationship of Mary and Charles was starting to deteriorate, as both struggled to cope with the stress of managing debts and an uncertain future. As financial pressures mounted, Charles's behavior began to change. The stress of their deteriorating financial situation seemed to affect his temper, and he became increasingly erratic and abusive towards Mary. Domestic violence, unfortunately, was a common issue in the 19th century, but it was rarely acknowledged or openly discussed. The prevailing societal norms at the time expected women to endure such mistreatment in silence, with the blame for any marital discord typically placed on the wife. However, Mary was not one to suffer quietly. She had helped with the financial success of the farm and had contributed her own money to its purchase. This gave her legal standing in the marriage. When Charles suggested selling the property to ease their financial troubles, Mary refused. She was worried he would take off with the sale proceeds, and as the law in Ohio stated that both the husband and the wife were required to sign for the sale of the property, she was well within her rights to withhold her agreement. This infuriated him, as he saw no other way out of their situation. In response to this refusal, he increasingly turned to violence as a way to try and force her into submission. His temper grew more unpredictable, and his threats became more frequent and severe. Charles threatened Mary's life on several occasions, and this was sometimes witnessed by neighbours, who were often alarmed by the severity of his outbursts. Despite the fear and isolation that came with the stigma of domestic abuse, Mary made the brave decision to report her husband's threats to the local authorities. This was an unusual and courageous step for a woman in her position, as the legal system at the time often ignored or minimalised cases of domestic violence. Often abusers were not held accountable for their own actions, and women were left to fend for themselves. Mary's decision to speak out was a rare challenge to the norms of the time. Charles was arrested and held in custody for 18 days, which provided Mary with a brief sense of relief. However, this was only a temporary reprieve. The legal system did not offer her the protection she needed. Instead, women were often expected to endure abuse without complaint. After his release, Mary filed a warrant against Charles, a legal measure that barred him from returning to their home. However, it had little effect, and undeterred, Charles attempted to reassert control over his family. But Mary was determined to protect herself and her children, so locked him out of the house, forcing him to sleep on the porch or in the barn. Eventually, on the 31st of September 1881, she filed for divorce, a bold move that was socially and legally challenging for women in 1880s USA. Charles continued to try and get back into the house, and his arguments with Mary persisted. At 5 a.m. in the morning of Tuesday the 11th of October 1881, Charles Bach arrived at the home of his neighbour, a man named Mr. Heinz, and calmly announced that he had killed his wife. Without showing any visible emotion, he left his 3 children in Mr. Heinz's care and announced that he was heading to the town of Bowling Green to surrender to the authorities. Horrified by the confession, Mr. Heinz quickly alerted his neighbours, and news of the murder rapidly spread. A group of local men gathered and decided to investigate the scene for themselves. When they arrived at the Bach residence, they found the front door locked, but managed to gain access through the back of the house. Inside, they were met with a horrifying sight. Mary's lifeless body lay on the floor, partially covered by a blood-soaked sheet. The room bore the unmistakable sign of a violent struggle, and blood was evident across the walls and ceiling. When the sheet was removed, the full extent of the brutality became clear. Mary had suffered fatal injuries to her head and upper body, and her right hand was severely damaged. 3 fingers lay nearby. When the men searched outside, they found a corn cutter with a heavy, sharp blade that had been discarded in the weeds about 100 yards from the house. It was stained with blood and hair, bearing the marks of the gruesome act. The small community was deeply shaken by the murder. While it was known that Charles Bach had been violent towards his wife, and that Mary had expressed growing fears for her safety after his release from jail, few could have predicted such a tragic and extreme outcome. Following Mr. Bach's surrender to the authorities in Bowling Green, more disturbing details of the crime came to light. It was believed that Mary's fingers had been severed as she valiantly tried to defend herself from her attacker, a desperate act, but emphasized the brutal nature of the assault. Her tragic fate served as a stark reminder of the harsh realities faced by women in abusive relationships, particularly during a time when legal protections were minimal and societal support for victims was virtually non-existent. The case highlighted the dire need for greater awareness and change in how domestic violence was addressed. Mary was laid to rest the following day in the Catholic cemetery in Custer, and Charles Bach was arrested and charged with her murder. The trial of Charles Bach began in February 1882 and became a great spectacle, drawing widespread attention from the public and the press. The case was notable, not only for its brutality, but also for the social issues it exposed, including domestic violence and the legal system's treatment of women. The court was told that for over a decade, Charles Bach, his wife Mary, and their 3 children had lived on a farm about 14 miles north of the village of Weston, in Wood County, in northwest Ohio, and it appeared that their life had been peaceful until disputes arose in early 1881. It was claimed that Charles wanted to sell the farm to alleviate himself from financial issues and then move west, but his wife Mary wanted to stay in Ohio and refused to agree to the sale. It was said that following his release, the couple agreed to separate, with Mary staying in the house and her husband retaining other possessions. However, despite this arrangement, Charles continued to sporadically live on the property, often sleeping on the back porch with Mary's reluctant permission. Witnesses included Charles and Mary's 14-year-old son named Charles Jr. He informed the court that on Monday the 10th of October 1881, he and his father had spent the day in Weston and later wandered through the village of Milton Centre before returning to the farmhouse later that evening. He said that after supper, his father entered his mother's bedroom and began arguing with her over some clothing. He went on to say that his mother threatened to have his father arrested again and that his father suddenly became enraged. Speaking in a shaky voice, he said that his father then pulled his mother from the bed and attacked her with a corn cutter. He added that he did not see anything else as he retreated to another room. However, the court fell silent when Charles Jr. said that when his father came out of the room, he told him that he had killed his mother. Mr. Hines was another witness. He told the court how the defendant had asked him to look after the children earlier on Tuesday the 11th of October, as he had just killed their mother. Mr. Hines added that Mr. Bach then told him that he was going to give himself up to the authorities in Bowling Green. During the trial, Charles's defense team attempted to justify his actions by portraying Mary as a neglectful wife who had failed in her domestic duties. They argued that her alleged inadequacies as a wife created a volatile environment, pushing Charles to his breaking point. This strategy reflected the prevailing attitudes towards marriage, where women were often blamed for marital discord, and their worth was judged by their ability to conform to traditional roles as obedient wives and nurturing mothers. Charles himself testified during the proceedings and used harsh and demeaning language to vilify Mary. He referred to her as a lazy animal with a loose mouth, attempting to portray her as the primary cause of the turmoil in their marriage. His testimony was carefully crafted to deflect responsibility onto Mary, casting her as the antagonist in their troubled relationship. By portraying her in such a negative light, Charles aimed to make his actions seem more justifiable and shift the focus away from his own responsibility for the violence. Charles's defense team also argued that the murder was an accident and that he only meant to wound his wife and not to kill her. Despite these efforts, the jury was unconvinced. Charles was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. However, there had been an issue with the jury selection process, and this prompted a retrial. The second trial was held 4 months later in June 1881 and produced the same outcome. Charles was once again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His defense appealed the verdict and sentence to the Supreme Court, and as he waited for the outcome, Charles sat in his jail cell and grew increasingly agitated by the relentless curiosity of others. Strangers came to peer at him like some morbid spectacle and would try to ask him foolish questions, such as how he felt, or worse, what he thought of his fate. At first, he tolerated these intrusions, but over time his patience wore thin. He refused to be seen and retreated to his cell whenever approached, covering himself entirely with his blankets, as if to shield himself from the invasive stares. It was reported that Charles found solace in his German Bible and would spend much time immersing himself in its pages, as though seeking redemption or peace. It was also stated that he occasionally wept, particularly when speaking of his children or confiding in acquaintances about the inevitability of his fate. As his execution date grew nearer, his appetite dwindled, and though he managed to sleep, the weight of his circumstances had visibly taken its toll. Yet amid all his sorrow, one thing stood out. He showed no remorse for his crime. There was no trace of guilt or regret for the murder of his wife. Instead, he seemed to harbour only bitterness towards her memory, a cold, unyielding resentment that had come to define him. Charles Bach was hanged on the 12th of October 1882 and later buried in Perrysburg. In a bizarre twist, 3 Wood County doctors were seen attempting to exhume his body. They had nearly reached the coffin when authorities intervened, and upon discovery, the 3 men fled the scene, evading arrest. The murder of Mary Elizabeth Bach and the subsequent trial left a lasting impact on the community. In the immediate aftermath, public and media attention focused on Charles and the trauma experienced by the couple's children, overshadowing Mary's life and suffering. Some accounts even blamed Mary for her own murder, citing her refusal to conform to traditional spousal roles as a provocation. Historians have since revisited the case, using it to highlight issues of domestic violence and the social norms that perpetuated victim blaming. The artifacts associated with Mary's murder, including her severed fingers, were preserved and displayed at the Wood County Courthouse before being transferred to the Wood County Museum. Over the years, these items have sparked ethical debates about the display of human remains. Critics argue that such exhibits can be exploitative, reducing individuals to objects of curiosity rather than honouring their humanity. In 2020, the museum collaborated with The Cocoon, a domestic violence advocacy group, to redesign the exhibits. The updated display humanises Mary and raises awareness about domestic violence. Visitors can choose whether to view the jar containing Mary's fingers, which is now kept under a labelled box. Mary Elizabeth Bach's story is one of resilience, tragedy and injustice. Her life and death highlight the challenges faced by women in the 19th century, particularly those who sought to stand up against abuse. The case also serves as a reminder of the failures that allowed domestic violence to persist unchecked. Through ongoing discussions and the telling of her story, Mary's legacy continues to inspire to address domestic abuse and promote justice for victims. Her life, though marked by hardship, remains a testament to the strength and courage of women who refuse to be silenced. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case